We usually think of travel as an escape, right? A chance to finally relax on a beach somewhere, stick to a fun itinerary, and just kind of insulate ourselves in total comfort. But what happens when you intentionally seek out the exact opposite? What happens when you drop into the most isolated or volatile regions on Earth with a one-way ticket and literally no plan? Well, let's dive right into today's explainer because we are unpacking the psychology of extreme travel. We're going to explore why the most dangerous and unstructured trips often yield the most profound human experiences, and why completely stripping away our safety nets fundamentally changes how we connect with humanity.
So I want you to picture this. Imagine standing at the Goma airport in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right as a rebel group violently takes over the surrounding area. I mean, this isn't a movie script we're talking about. This is a direct, real-world account from an extreme solo traveler who found himself completely trapped just as the M23 militia flooded the streets with heavy weaponry. The military and police were scrambling, and the air was just thick with this immediate, looming threat of war. Just picture the sheer intimidation of that moment. You are so far outside your comfort zone, and suddenly the standard rules of being a tourist, yeah, they no longer apply.
And the escape from this situation was just an escalating sequence of pure terror mixed with, honestly, a bit of absurdity. First, as he was approaching this incredibly fragile airport setup, the military actually accused him of being an undercover agent. They were aggressively demanding he hand over weapons he didn't even have. Then, after somehow navigating that terrifying hurdle in a language he barely spoke, the airport officials tried to extort him for about $3, claiming he had illegal gun magazines in his tiny backpack. And then, for the grand finale of this ordeal, the airport didn't even have basic computers working. His literal lifeline out of an active war zone was a boarding pass handwritten in a register. Now here's the absolute kicker. This wasn't just some perceived, in-his-head kind of threat. It was a deadly reality. Just 40 hours, less than 2 days, after that handwritten ticket got him on a plane out of Goma, that exact same rebel group shot down an aircraft in that very airspace. The danger was absolute. It really forces you to realize just how insulated we usually are from that razor-thin line between life and death, a line that people in unstable regions have to navigate every single day.
So, looking at all this, you really have to ask yourself, why? What psychological reward could possibly outweigh the risk of literally being trapped in a war zone? Because let's be real, most of us would gladly choose a luxury beach resort in Europe over getting extorted in hostile territory. So what is that magnetic pull of the unknown? Well, it actually comes down to how extreme discomfort and unpredictability completely rewire our brains. It strips away our superficial layers and forces us to engage with the world in a state of raw, unfiltered presence.
And a massive part of that comes from the power of extreme spontaneity. Ditching the itinerary completely changes how you experience the world. It's not just about, forgetting to book a hotel. It's a deliberate psychological tool. Think about it. When you have no idea where you're sleeping tomorrow or what country you might even be in next week, you physically cannot live in the future. You are violently anchored to the present moment. And that forces this heightened state of awareness. Suddenly, colors seem brighter. Conversations feel so much more urgent. And that general numbness of our modern, heavily scheduled lives, it just completely disappears.
It's a totally different dynamic from what most of us are used to. When you travel in a group, you're essentially carrying this little micro bubble of your home culture with you, right? Your plans clash, you compromise, and honestly, you interact mostly with each other. But extreme solo travel, without that safety net, it grants you infinite flexibility. You basically become this fluid entity. You can seamlessly insert yourself into any local group, absorbing their interests, their rhythms, and their culture, simply because you aren't tied down by a return ticket or a group consensus. You're forced to merge with the environment rather than just observing it from behind tourist glass. And this brings us to a really fascinating paradox. It turns out that geographical isolation and extreme vulnerability actually accelerate human warmth. Now, society teaches us to project strength, to always be self-reliant. But when you travel to the absolute edges of the earth, you figure out pretty quickly that self-reliance is kind of a myth. You have to rely on strangers to navigate, to eat, just to stay safe. And the crazy thing is, when you show up in a state of absolute vulnerability, when you clearly, undeniably need help, it triggers this deep, almost instinctual desire in locals to protect and embrace you.
Let me give you a mind-blowing example. 250. That is the total number of tourists that visit Tuvalu in an entire year. Tuvalu is this tiny Pacific nation so incredibly isolated that the locals literally play volleyball on the airport runway between the 2 weekly flights. Just let that number sink in. 250 people a year. That's a fraction of the foot traffic at your local grocery store on a Tuesday.
This sovereign country is basically a 200-meter wide strip of land in the middle of the ocean. When you visit a place this far removed from the massive global tourism machine, you aren't treated like a walking wallet. You are a profound curiosity. You're a rare guest.
And our traveler's experience there proves this perfectly. He arrived with absolutely zero luggage because the airline had strict weight limits and just left it behind. Stripped of all his possessions, with literally just the clothes on his back and no identification, he couldn't even legally run a scooter. He was totally 100% dependent. But instead of this turning into a massive crisis, that forced vulnerability actually opened a door. A local stepped right in, totally bypassed all the bureaucratic red tape, and just personally vouched for this total stranger.
I absolutely love this moment. Atu, a local guy who was just radiating joy and wearing flowers in his hair, didn't ask for a passport or a security deposit. He just looked at this stranded traveler from thousands of miles away, wrapped an arm around him, and told the rental guy, "No ID needed. This is my brother from India." In our highly structured, super litigious societies, that level of instant, raw trust is almost unheard of. But extreme travel? It forces you right out of those transactional relationships and drops you straight into genuinely human ones.
Okay, so let's pivot for a second, because isolation isn't always geographic. Sometimes it's intensely political. Take war-torn Syria, for example. If a remote island paradise teaches us about isolation, a highly militarized zone teaches us about the absolute resilience of the human spirit. During a period of intense political instability there, with military checkpoints every single kilometer, you'd probably expect nothing but hostility and deep suspicion. But the reality on the ground, far away from the scary news headlines, tells a completely different story about human nature.
We uncovered this incredible, beautiful paradox. Often, the most unstable and poverty-stricken places yield the absolute warmest human connections. Just look at the contrast. On one hand, you have the crushing reality of a relentless military presence. You have citizens working brutal 20-hour shifts and soldiers making the equivalent of maybe $3 a day. It's harsh. Yet, on the flip side, the human response was just this profound, genuine excitement that a foreigner actually chose to visit their home. People who barely knew where their next meal was coming from were the very first ones to invite a stranger in and share whatever little food they had. It really radically shifts your entire perspective on gratitude and what wealth actually means. And it's also the ultimate example of soft power in action. Soft power isn't about weapons or economics, it's about connecting through culture and shared joys. At those terrifying Syrian military checkpoints, or even in remote African villages, all that intense tension would just instantly melt away the second soldiers recognized where the traveler was from. They'd start excitedly shouting out the names of Bollywood actors or singing old Hindi movie songs. It's amazing. It proves that despite these massive, intimidating geopolitical divides, a shared love for cultural entertainment can instantly build a life-saving bridge of humanity. So bringing it all together, stripping away extreme comfort really is a recipe for a deeply meaningful life experience. It forces you to be fiercely present. It proves that when you have absolutely nothing, you have to rely on strangers, and those strangers almost always come through for you. It completely shatters all those heavy prejudices we build up from just consuming negative news all day. And most importantly, it teaches us that vulnerability isn't some weakness you need to hide. It is literally the most powerful tool we have for establishing authentic, deep connections with our fellow human beings. We spend so much of our lives building walls, buying insurance, and planning every tiny detail just to avoid risk. But I want to leave you with this thought today. In insulating ourselves from danger and discomfort, are we also insulating ourselves from the rawest, most beautiful parts of the human experience? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I'll see you next time.